Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining. We will go ahead and get started for today's virtual update with Congresswoman Betty McCollum of Minnesota's 4th Congressional District. Please use your mobile device to scan our QR code on the screen to access the statements, resources, and other information discussed today, or visit mccollum.house.gov/contact to get in touch. With that, I will turn it over to Congresswoman McCollum to give us an update on what's happening this week in Washington.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining me today and for your questions. They really helped inform us on what we're going to cover today. It probably is no surprise, 95% of the questions you submitted were either on the threat of the federal government shutdown or about the conflict in the Middle East. For the 5% of you who have questions on various other topics, rest assured that you will receive an email response from me by the end of the day. So here's what's been happening in Washington. Instead of working with Democrats on a bipartisan solution to keep the government operating for the American people, Speaker Johnson and the extreme MAGA Republicans are playing political games, and they're pushing their radical funding bills on the House floor. Just last week, Republicans were unable to pass on the House floor 2 of their own funding bills, a bill to fund the transportation and housing in our country, as well as a bill to fund financial enforcement programs and government agencies. They loaded these bills up with extreme social policy riders, underfunded important programs, and then realized they didn't even have their own votes to pass them. This failure was a waste of more legislative time after we spent 22 days delayed in electing the current Speaker of the House. And then yesterday, House Democrats once again prevented a government shutdown. House Democrats provided the votes to pass a continuing resolution, while the Republican majority allowed their extremists in their conference to dictate the agenda of the House of Representatives. Now, I voted for this temporary stopgap funding bill to keep our government open and in order to stop more Republican chaos. My vote was only to prevent a shutdown. I want to be crystal clear. Speaker Johnson's laddered continuing resolution is not a long-term solution to responsibly fund our government, and this only will add to the chaos and uncertainty that the Republicans continue to move forward with. The Speaker's refusal to set a top-line spending number for our federal agencies is irresponsible, because without an agreement on overall spending, the Republicans will try to continue to make these devastating cuts on programs that Americans rely on. We cannot forget the last shutdown crisis. The Republicans overwhelmingly voted for massive funding cuts through federal agencies. And let me just give you a few examples, some that I think really hit at home. They wanted a 47% cut, a 60. I am having a moment with my contacts. Give me a second. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm in focus again. The Republicans, as an example, wanted a 74% cut to low-income energy assistance programs, or LAHEAP. 74%. That would leave families out in the cold. A 30% cut to nutrition support for women, infants, and children, taking away a lifeline for hungry families and pregnant women, and a loss of thousands of dollars in research grants to cure Alzheimer's disease, cancers, heart disease. I could go on. And then tens of thousands fewer safety inspections for everything from railways to the food on our grocery shelves. Democrats, we stood united to oppose that bill, but far too many Republicans remain determined to cut funding to the American people. And this is why I'm deeply concerned about what could happen. If we don't know the funding levels Republicans will use after this continuing resolution expires in January and the rest of it in February, the Speaker needs to get serious about a bipartisan process to finish these bills responsibly to fund our entire government for the rest of the year. So without knowing what the top line numbers are, we can't negotiate with the Senate, and we can't even negotiate with Republicans on what we need to do. So along with hearing about what we need to do to keep the government open, Congress also has a responsibility to address emergencies in the supplemental funding request from the president. The president has asked Congress for $56 billion to address domestic priorities that impact working families. Here are just a few of those priorities in the emergency bill. Additional disaster relief for FEMA, and that would have included funding recovery for the Maui wildland fire, the hurricane in Florida, floods in California, and other severe weather events you've all read about in the papers. And funding for the low-income energy assistance program, which helps families cover home heating costs. Now, remember, the Republicans tried to cut it 74%, but this would have even been another cut happening because we could not get the emergency supplemental bill through that the president had to help our seniors and our families right now, because everybody deserves a warm home. The president also requested $106 billion to address the urgent global crisis we face. Among priorities in this request are continued support for Ukraine. And by the way, Ukraine has no more US dollars available to it in its fight for keeping its democracy. We needed this bill to move forward. It also included military assistance to Israel, which supports the Iron Dome missile defense. But what was really urgently needed, and so many of you wrote to me about, was the humanitarian relief for Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Speaker Johnson's failure to include any of the president's emergency funding requests in the vote that the House took yesterday to keep the government open, bottom line, it was a huge mistake, and it's one that needs to be addressed immediately in the coming weeks. One of the questions I received from constituents in various forms was, how did I vote on Speaker Johnson's $4 billion legislation to provide military aid to Israel? Well, I voted no, and here's why. For the first time in history, we had a vote on the floor that was put forward on a partisan basis. So I agreed, working with J Street and many others, to cast a no vote on the Speaker's partisan bill. Democrats and Republicans have always worked together on foreign aid bills on a bipartisan basis because it's our national foreign policy. The Speaker was the one who decided to go it alone with Republican votes only, and only aid for Israel. For a party that says they are also so worried about government spending, the Speaker's bill paid for the military assistance for Israel by cutting IRS enforcement actions against very wealthy tax cheats. Bottom line, this move by the Republicans would have actually cost taxpayers money to the tune of $12 billion. So this bill has no chance of becoming law in the Senate and no chance of the president signing it. Now I'm going to go directly to many of the questions that we had on the conflict in Israel and Gaza. First, I want to thank the thousands of constituents who have reached out to me, expressing their deep sadness and at times the outrage that they're feeling about the escalating violence. The world was horrified by Hamas's barbaric attacks on Israeli families and the kidnapping of hostages on October 7th. And I want to be clear, Hamas is a terrorist organization, and Hamas's goal is the total elimination of the nation of Israel. So here's what I've been focused and working on since the violence erupted. These attacks were crimes against humanity and the brazen violation of international law. And I condemn the attacks against Israel that happened. Israel does have the right to self-defense and security. But on October 13th, I spoke to President Biden directly, and I told him that the humanitarian aid to the Palestinian civilians in Gaza was not being delivered swiftly or effectively, and he needed to do more. He also heard that I was gravely concerned about the violence that was spinning out of control, and that other regional actors were becoming involved in the conflict. And that's why on October 17th, I called for a regional ceasefire. I called on the administration to work harder with regional partners to get life-saving humanitarian aid into Gaza as well. On October 20th, once again, I called for humanitarian aid trucks to reach millions of Palestinians in need. And I also want to point out, many of you know I've been working to protect children in the West Bank and Gaza while in Congress. I've worked on stopping the expansion of illegal settlements in the West Bank, the detention of Palestinian children by Israeli Defense Forces, and the funding that needs to continue along with humanitarian aid relief in Gaza. But we have to deal with what's in front of us right now. And so for me, and I'm sure for many of you, one of the worst parts of this tragedy is that so many children have been directly impacted by this violence. Thousands of children have been killed in this conflict, and that's nothing less than heartbreaking and wrong. Just this week, I worked with my colleagues, Ocasio-Cortez and Representative Pocan, to author a letter to President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken. We strongly ask that President Biden's administration needed to put an immediate pause to work towards a regional ceasefire. We felt this is necessary because the Israeli government response was including widespread airstrikes on residential buildings and even refugee camps. And in all of this, Palestinian families who were caught in the middle of two warring factors. Israel's response at times has been nothing but shocking. And it's deeply disappointing that President Netanyahu has refused President Biden's calls for pauses, for more humanitarian assistance to be delivered to Gaza, and that Israel should not occupy Gaza at the end of this conflict. But Hamas has also been putting Palestinian families at grave risk. They deliberately use civilians as human shields and will continue to hold the hostages from the attacks of October 7th, including children. Civilian suffering, particularly that of children, will continue until there is a robust regional ceasefire that can be reached. The letter closes by asking President Biden's administration to press his case directly with all partners in the region, and it was just sent this week to the President and Secretary Blinken. In recent weeks, I've also voted against several Republican bills and resolutions that include a bill that would have caused more delays to humanitarian aid to Gaza. I've also added my signature to 9 letters to President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and congressional leaders on this conflict. These include requests for additional humanitarian assistance to Palestinian citizens, and we need to do more to make sure the humanitarian assistance gets delivered from our government and from other organizations into Gaza. I've also signed a letter to the administration urging them to press the Israeli government to crack down on settler violence in the West Bank. These attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank are outrageous, and they risk further inflaming the conflict. They must stop immediately. Now, earlier in this conversation, I shared with you why we need a regional ceasefire. So many of you asked a direct question, one that we heard over and over and over again, and that is, why am I not a co-sponsor of the ceasefire resolution introduced by Representative Cori Bush? Now, I've spoken with Representative Bush. We talk on the floor a lot, and she clearly knows my position. And she understands that together we are focused on ending the violence in Gaza. But as I pointed out to her, and I've said publicly time and time again, I truly believe a regional ceasefire is necessary to stop the violence against citizens. Now, I shared with Representative Bush, my opinion on why I could not sign on to her ceasefire legislation, because it takes too narrow of a view of how to achieve a lasting end to the violence. For a ceasefire to really work, it just can't be one-sided. A ceasefire will not be reached simply by the United States calling on Israel to stop their military response. As you know, we have not been successful in getting Israel to do even long pauses. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and that means the United States and Israel cannot directly negotiate with them because there's no one to directly negotiate with. And then there's Hezbollah, a non-state actor that continues right now to fire rockets from Lebanon, forcing, as we speak now, Israeli citizens to evacuate their homes. So any discussion must include Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, and other regional partners. And that's why we require the support of the international community and the regional nations to help to work with us to achieve an end to this violence. And that's why I have been deliberate and will consistently be using the word regional ahead of ceasefire when I make public statements. On a personal note, I want many of you to know what an honor it's been to work with Palestinian rights organizations, along with many Israeli organizations and Israelis who feel as passionate about protecting Palestinians and working towards a two-state solution as I do. And I look forward to continuing our work together. But that's why the work that I do, I want you to know that my goal always is for the future that every Palestinian child, every Israeli child will be tucked into bed at night by their parents without a fear of bombings and perpetual violence. All people, everyone deserves safety and security, and the only sustainable path forward is one in which the international human rights and international law are at the forefront. So know that I will continue to use my voice and my vote in Congress to advocate for peace, and that means a regional ceasefire and international cooperation to get aid into Gaza immediately. So as I close, know that there's a lot going on in Congress, from global crises to keeping our government open and funded and working for you here at home. I remain focused on delivering for Minnesota families, investing in America, empowering workers, lowering costs, and building an economy that works for all Americans. And in Minnesota, my team in the Minnesota office, they're available for you. So check your passport. If it's expiring soon, let's work on getting you a new one. If you need help with Social Security, our office stands ready to help. I was just with the veterans, a veterans celebration in Evergrove Grove Heights, recognize Veterans Day. And veterans, we stand ready to work with your Veterans County Service Officer and you to get every single benefit you deserve. Student loans right now, a lot of questions about what's happening on that. Call our office if you need help, or if you need help with any other federal agency. And know that you can see all of my statements, all the letters, and all the actions that I have taken on stopping the violence in the Middle East is all in one place on the link on this screen, or if you go to my website, you'll be directed to that. I want to stay in touch with the most up-to-date information here in Washington. So I'm reading newspapers and checking press and everything at home. So I need to encourage you as a step towards staying up to date with what I'm doing to subscribe to my newsletter. And you can check that off on my website, mccollum.house.gov. So if you're on social media, you can follow me on Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Twitter, better known as Twitter, but now X. But please, as always, do not hesitate to reach out to my office in St. Paul or in Washington. I am so grateful that all of you have taken time to write or call my office. Your voice matters. I want to thank you for being engaged, and I want to thank you for listening to this update. And thank you always for making your voice heard. Let us all join together to pray for peace in the Middle East, around the world, and for each other. Enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday. Thank you.
Thanks so much again for joining us today. And a reminder, you can use the QR code, which we'll leave up here on the screen for just a moment longer if you would like to scan it and get plugged in. Thanks so much and have a great day.